What up, guys? This is Pete, the Carrot Man here for the Carrot Poker Podcast, and this is going to be the third episode that we're going to be delving into a little bit of the contents of my book that'll be coming out in a couple of months' time, hopefully. Hopefully January. I'm shooting for January, but there's been a lot of real life stuff going on, kind of disrupting the writing progress and disrupting the sort of the writer's zen I had before when things were a little bit less chaotic, but I'm getting there. So this is basically the podcast where we talk about the series of podcasts, where we talk about what's going to be in the book, give you guys a little bit of a synopsis, but give you guys something that's actually useful for you as well, and go into enough detail as to what's in the book that it's actually going to benefit you without going into so much that I basically read the whole book to you page by page, because that wouldn't be very productive for either you or for me. So anyway, we're on to chapter 2 now, which is all about, the chapter is called When Someone Has Limped, or When Someone's Limped. And in chapter 1 we talked a lot about required fold equity for opening. We talked a lot about opening ranges from different positions and dynamic considerations that you would have to take into account before you decide on an opening range for any given spot pre-flop. Now we're going to continue along the same vein, but talk about what changes when someone has actually limped before us, or multiple people have limped before us. The context of this book, by the way, is 6 max cash, so every example that I give will be a 6-handed table, but that's not to say that a lot of this stuff isn't completely relevant for full ring as well. For anyone grinding full ring cash, it completely is, and even to some extent for tournament insight and go players, but to a lesser extent for sure. Anyway, so what changes when someone's limped? Well, there's more dead money in the middle that we're going to be picking up when we actually win the pot at some point pre-flop or post-flop with fold equity. But it also means that we are way less likely to win the pot pre-flop, and we're going to be seeing a flop a lot more often as well. So let me go through, first of all, why open limping is just not a good strategy, because we want to know what we're actually exploiting here when we isolate. And this like I say, this segment is all about isolating, or ISOing, as I'm going to be calling it for shorthand. That's what it means. When someone says ISO in poker, they're talking about raising pre-flop after one or more people have limped, not opening. It's different. Okay, so open limping. Limping is the first player into the pot, just like open raising is to raise as the first player into the pot, other than the blinds. To open limp is to be the first limper into the pot, first person to call, other than, I guess, the first person to call. It's a pretty much a fine definition of open limping. This is bad because it does a few things. One, it gains no initiative and makes it harder to win pots post-flop. It also invites multi-way situations that again make it harder to pick up the dead money and improve the red line, which is a non-showdown line that basically benefits a lot when we can just pick up the pot, and that's going to be better when we are not multi-way, when we are just heads up. And it fails to thin the field, which is bad for hands that like to flop one pair and win at showdown. These hands are even capable of getting a lot of value, like king, queen, or whatever. It is absolutely fine. Heads up, even three-way in some situations when it's going to be flopping top pair hands a lot, and those hands are very often going to be good, but if you run that against 5 other hands, it's very likely not going to be best, at least by the river. So multi-way situations are just not going to be ideal for our range when we want to play from under the gun, and therefore we want to thin the field by raising. That's just one of the basic things. So open limping fails to do that. It fails to gain initiative. It fails to get value. It fails to build the pot because we play a tighter range from the earlier positions. Especially, we fail to get more money into the pot with that range, and when we're in position we want money in the pot as well, usually speaking, because we can A, win the blinds pre-flop by putting money into the pot, or B, we can just inflate the pot when we have a positional advantage and possibly even a skill advantage as well, or even a range advantage to go with that over our opponents. So basically, open limping sucks, and we can exploit it by isolating, especially when we have position. And I'm going to introduce to you the model that I use. It'd be better if this wasn't a podcast and was a video right now for me to actually show you, but you'll see this diagram in full if you purchase the book, and it's called the ISO triangle. And the idea with the triangle, like any triangle, it has 3 sides, it has 3 points, and that is to represent the fact that there are actually 3 factors that go into isolating, or an ISO decision, that make it either good or bad. The more of these 3 points in the triangle, or factors that we have going for us, the better and the more inclined we should be to ISO. And the less of these factors we have going, the worse and the more inclined we should be to not ISO, which will take the form of either folding, most commonly, or sometimes on rarer occasions, limping behind, which is fine and completely different from open limping and does not fall victim to necessarily to all those caveats we just spoke about that make open limping a bad strategy. Anyway, so what are the 3 points in the ISO triangle? What are these 3 factors you want to consider before you decide whether or not to isolate a limper? Well, we're looking for, in order of most importance, first, frequent strength is very important. Now, frequent strength is not just equity. This is a different thing. Equity is the measure of how often your hand will win at showdown, if the cards will run out with no more money going into the pot, no more action. Basically, cards are flipped face up. How often are you going to win? What's your share of the pot based on your hand against your opponent's hands or ranges? That's equity. But frequent strength is a bit different because it takes into account the fact that there's playability still left in the hand. We have to play the flop to turn the river. We have to make good decisions there. We have to have a hand that's capable of making good decisions there, and it's going to be like reasonably high EV after the flop. So a hand that has frequent strength is a hand that frequently connects well with the flop. Pocket sixes might have reasonable equity against your opponent's range, but it does not have frequent strength because on most boards it's going to flop like third pair, second pair. Very rarely is it going to flop an overpair, and if it does, it's a very vulnerable and not so great overpair. So sixes is a hand that doesn't have much frequent strength because frequently on the flop, it's weak. Like sure, it can flop a set, and that's a mammoth, monstrous hand, but that doesn't happen frequently, and that's the key is in the name here, frequent strength. How often does your hand connect well with a flop? A hand like ace-king offsuit has heaps and heaps of frequent strength because when it connects with the flop, it flops top pair, top kicker, and more importantly for frequent strength, it connects with the flop often. 1 in 3 or so times it's going to be flopping top pair. It's a very frequently strong hand. A set you only make 1 in 9 or 10 times. It's not going to be anywhere near as good frequent strength wise. So why do we want frequent strength when we isolate a limper? Because that allows us to actually extract value often post flop, which is part of the value of isolating. Part of the reason we isolate is to get value post flop against weaker players, especially when we have position, which we'll get to. But certainly frequent strength hands are more likely to give you value often than a hand like pocket fours or ace 3 off or whatever. These hands have lesser frequent strength. So what are you looking for in frequent strength? You're looking for big cards that can flop top pair mainly, but if you have suited hands and connected hands, these actually go along with it as well and give you some frequent strength. For example, 10-9 suited has a good bit of frequent strength because for one, it has 2 big cards or 2 big-ish cards that can flop top pairs or decent sized pairs. For 2, it's connected and it can flop straight draws, and 3, it's suited, it can flop flush draws. And yeah, it's just going to be a very versatile all-round hand with a good amount of frequent strength, but nowhere near as much as something like King Queen off that can flop top pair way more often than 10-9 suited would flop like a straight or a flush or trips or whatever. So we're looking at those things. A hand with bad frequent strength would be like 3-5 offsuit, pocket twos, ace 6 off. These hands just don't flop strong very often. Like sometimes they can flop the nuts, sure, as any hand can in No Limit Hold'em, but they're just not going to have that much frequent strength. And so a hand like ace 4 offsuit is going to need a good bit of help from the other factors to become an ISO, whereas king queen off is very rarely going to need any help from the other factors to become an ISO. The more frequent strength you have, the more of this first point in the triangle you have, the less of the other 2 points you're going to need. I don't know if a triangle is really the best analogy for this. I like to think of it as there are like 3 valves pumping goodness into the triangle, and the more full the triangle is of that goodness, the more you want to isolate. The more empty it is, the more you should be inclined to choose between the other options of just calling or folding, opposite that limp. So second point in the triangle is almost as important, if not equally important, as frequent strength, and that is fold equity. Fold equity can take the form of pre-flop fold equity if you're against a very weak fish that just likes to limp and then fold. That's very profitable for you. I was playing live at the Borgata like a few months ago, and this dude actually limped under the gun with ace king and just folded to an ISO and showed the ace king offsuit and said he didn't like the hand. If you're against a player like that, that's obviously just completely ridiculous, and that's just amazing that you're going to make so much value pre-flop just by stealing with extra money in the pot. It just sweetens the price of a steal, much like an anti-structure would in a tournament. It's just free dead money. But more often, what's going to be the case is that you don't have loads of pre-flop fold equity, but your fold equity actually comes in the form of post-flop fold equity. And in this kind of situation, you're going to be very inclined to steal, knowing that your fold equity is delayed until the flop. Like you're going to be isolating fish to make sure that you get them to yourself after the flop, so that when you c-bet, you're only c-betting into one player, and more importantly, that player is like a fit or fold guy who's actually going to give up a lot on the flop when he doesn't connect too well. So fold equity is super important. You're going to have fold equity against player types, basically. So let's go into, well, we'll go into player types in a minute. I think I'll go through the third factor first. But yeah, back to that second factor, you need fold equity in order to open hands or to isolate hands with less frequent strength, and you need frequent strength to isolate hands with less fold equity. They're inversely proportionate in terms of requirement. The less of one you have, the more of the others you're going to need. The more of one you have, the less of the others you're going to need. Factor 3, we're going to just call position because that's what it is. It's pretty simple. If you're in position, life is sweeter for you. You are able to take away more pots. You have more fold equity on the flop because it's harder for your opponents to float you or make speculative calls, given that they're going to be out of position for the rest of the hand. Position also allows you more information and lets you make better decisions. It allows you to control the size of the pot, inject money in it on every street that you want to, or stop that happening where you want to. Gives you more control over that. It allows you to get more value because of that very reason. You can control that money goes into the pot. And yeah, it's just life is so much better in position that position can easily turn what would be a close or slightly minus EV ISO, like you have ace-5 offsuit, and the player is kind of fit or fold, but not super fit or fold, and he limps, and you've got two tight players behind. This is probably going to be a really easy raise from the button, but probably closer to being just a complete when you're in the small blind, because bloating that pot out of position with the disadvantages could be worse than limping, but clearly in position, isolating is good. Position's the least important of the factors, but it is still very, very important. Like it does change whether or not a lot of hands are going to be ISO raises or not, for sure. So those are the three factors that you need to think about in this triangle. Frequent strength, the ability to connect often with the flop in a good way that can help you extract value. Fold equity, the ability to win the pot from your opponents either pre-flop but more commonly post-flop. And position, enough said about that. So that's the triangle. Let's talk about what kind of things actually give you fold equity. Like how does player type, villain type actually affect whether you would want to ISO, what kind of range you would want to ISO. So there are a few types of fish. The first one, who is like your best friend, is the fit or fold fish. And this is the guy that existed more commonly in like 2009 than these days. I think everyone just folds less these days in general, for better or for worse, probably for worse for us. In some senses, certainly, on the early streets. And that means that, you know, people fold their blinds less, they fold the c-bets less, that kind of thing. And that means that isolating is not as amazing as it used to be when we don't have much frequent strength or position. Like I remember the days when I could just raise up like queen 8 off from the small blind after a fish limped in early position, and they would just fold the flop 60% to me, and I was just making money, and that was great. But these days it doesn't really work like that so much. But that said, there are still an abundance of passive fish who are fit or fold, and it's just a matter of finding them, table selecting, sitting on their left, and making sure that you isolate them really wide. Against these guys, especially when you have position, I can think of times when a fish limps the cutoff, you've got two very tight players in the blinds, and 7 deuce off is legitimately a good ISO in a vacuum and overall in long term as well, against a fish that's just not going to adjust to you, it's just going to play fit or fold forever, and you can just print a lot of money there. Another very common spot where fit or fold fish need to be exploited with 100% of your range is when they limp your small blind. If a fish is limping your small blind, and then either folding to a raise or calling pre-flop and playing fit or fold on the flop, then you just have a heap of fold equity in over both of those streets combined. And so what you need to do is take 7-4 off and raise and c-bet fairly small and just give yourself a good price, like that RFE, that required fold equity we talked about in part 2 of this series, and just basically be looking to build up the pot and take it down at some point, and that's going to be hugely plus EV against the fit or fold fish. Things change dramatically there, even in position blind versus blind, against this wide completing range when you don't have such a cooperative villain, when you have a fish who's going to be giving you more trouble. So what are the other types of fish then that you get that limp? And I'm assuming, by the way, that any player that open limps before the flop is a fish, and therefore that's why we're not talking about isolating against regs here so much. If a reg limps your small blind, they're definitely defending a lot more of their range there on the flop and pre-flop. But it does happen. Some regs play that kind of limping small blind strategy, but it's not so common these days. It kind of was one of those fads, a bit like I guess mini disc players that was in for like a few weeks or something, and then we realized quickly that they were just impractical and they were like an unnecessary step in the evolution of poker or of playing music, and they were just eradicated. Mini disc players, like, who even had one of those things, honestly? So that's a bit like that strategy. But anyway, I digress. So when it comes to player type, there are some less cooperative types of fish, like the station fish, who is going to require that you have more frequent strength when you choose to isolate him, because you have less fold equity. Whenever you're lacking fold equity, you need to make up in the form of the other factors in the triangle to fill the valves from the valves of that triangle and get that triangle nice and full so that it makes a plus EV ISO. So against a station fish, you should favour big cards with frequent strength, ones with versatility and big cards. Stuff like good suited connectors, decent pairs, good big cards, broadways, even offsuit broadways, big aces, reasonably big aces, ace 9 off, that kind of thing. You want hands that flop top pair often because your aim is not... You do want fold equity on the best textures where you can still c-bet, but there are a lot more textures against this guy, the station fish, that you actually can't c-bet profitably. And so on those textures, what you need to be doing is actually extracting value, and that's going to require that you actually hit the flop a lot of the time because you don't have fold equity. So frequent strength is a lot more important against both the station fish and also the aggro fish. Even more so against the aggro fish, because not only is he going to call you down really stupidly wide with ace high and bottom pair, like the station fish is, but the aggro fish is also going to take 8 high and bluff you on the flop sometimes. So you have even less fold equity against the aggro fish than you do against the station fish, because the aggro fish is actually like looking to fight back actively with bluffs as well, whereas the station fish just doesn't want to fold any reasonable piece, ever. So they're a bit different, but both require that you have a lot of frequent strength, and position is infinitely better against both of these player types because, you know, they're both not folding, and you want to control the size of the pot when you don't have anything, or you have a moderate hand you want to like pot control with. And more importantly, just you can get more value in position. It's much better for you, and therefore, given value as your goal against these player types, you really do favour position quite substantially. So, given that fold equity is very limited against these two types of fish, you need a decent mix of frequent strength and position. Like ace 10 off is going to be an ISO against a button limper, no matter who the guy is, because there's so much frequent strength. That's fine. But ace 8 off is probably going to require position there. That's kind of where I would draw the line, just to give you guys a flavour and example, but do some practice actually weighing this up. What we'll probably do next time is go over some examples of ISO spots, maybe a couple picked out of the book, just to give you guys a flavour for how I would apply this in game and which hands are ISOs and which hands aren't. Really briefly, I forgot to include this at the start, but isolating is really, really important. It's a huge share of your red line winnings, and it's a huge share of also your blue line winnings as well, because both being able to extract fold equity on the flop from fish that play fit or fold and get stationary bad fish to yourself so that you're the beneficiary of their mistakes is really important. These two things are very central to both the red and the blue line and to your win rate. So ISO spots are super important. That's why I want to spend like a couple of episodes on them in this series. Okay, we're going to now talk about what do we do if we decide that the ISO... Well, let's discuss sizing briefly. There's a rule for ISO sizing, which is that in general you should be looking at least one big blind on your raise size for each limper, extra big blind. So you can start off with 3 big blinds as your base, and then 1 extra big blind for every limper in the pot. That doesn't include like the blinds who are yet to act. There's people who have limped into the pot. So if 2 people limp and you're in the button, you would typically be going 3 + 1 + 1 for each limper is 5 BBs. But if you're out of position, the extension of this rule is that I like to say that you should add another big blind there because you need to increase fold equity. Going multi-way is even worse out of position. It's going to hurt your EV even more when you're out of position. You really want to secure that heads-up pot so that your C-bets can still have some fold equity. You definitely need to go bigger out of position and in position to encourage fold equity. People are just less inclined to fold when they have position on you. Even fish understand that much. So it's very important for you to actually use that and add an extra BB, not just for each limper, but for being out of position as well. ISO sizing is pretty basic. It's pretty straightforward, I think. One thing to be aware of, we'll talk more about this in hand examples next time, is when there are aggressive regulars actually aware of your strategy to isolate a fit or fold fish wide. Like say there's a fit or fold fish in the cutoff, you're in the button, and you're going to be isolating a lot there. The blinds are probably, if they're aware, going to start 3-betting you wider than normal and making life a bit difficult for you in that situation. So you got to be careful with that for sure. And how can you adjust your sizing to deal with that? You can make it smaller. You lose a little bit of the value you would otherwise gain by building up a bigger pot to take down against the fit or fold fish, but you save a bunch of money when you get 3-bet and it's more defensible. You can actually defend more of your range for lots of mathematical reasons to do with the price that you're getting and how profitable it's going to be basically just to flat a hand against the 3-bet. And also when you fold, you just lose a lot less money if you made your ISO like 3.5x instead of 4. It's going to add up over the long run in cash, especially when you're just playing a lot of these spots all the time in 6-max. But in 6-max, most spots are steal spots. That's the thing. That's the thing that makes the game so fascinating. Or at least semi-steal spots. So, moving on now to what we do if we don't want to isolate. if the first port of call for us is always to decide whether or not an ISO is likely to be plus EV, and then doing it if it is likely to be plus EV, and not doing it if it's not. But the next part of this is, what do we actually do if we decide it's not a good idea? Well, then we need to look into limping behind versus folding. When should you limp behind? And remember, this is not as taboo as open limping. There is definitely a time and a place for limping behind. And if you play in six max games that ever contain limpers or fish, and you never have a limping behind range, then you're definitely doing it wrong. That can be a shock to some students of mine, but most people do have a limp behind game for sure. And you should do. What spots do you want to do this in? Well, when fold equity is lacking, and the reason for not isolating is not that you have 4 deuce off because you don't want to limp that, it's more to do with the fact that you have an implied oddsy hand, a hand that can flop really big sometimes, but it lacks the frequent strength and the fold equity to actually isolate. In that situation, you still probably do want to realise the implied odds of that hand. And if you don't have fold equity, guess what? You have more implied odds. And that's because the two are inversely proportionate. The more fold equity you have, the worse your implied odds are, because your opponent's not likely to pay you off as often because he's folding a higher amount. And the less fold equity you have, the more likely you are to get paid off because your opponent's not finding folds. He's a station fish and aggro fish, and therefore limping those pocket threes after he limps is very sensible, because while you don't want to build up a huge pot or a big pot or whatever, even a medium pot or a smallish pot that's bigger than a non-raised pot, you don't want to raise, basically, because you're going to flop an underpair 8/9 of the time. And when you do, you're not going to get fold equity, and you've got a horrible hand to c-bet because it has 2 outs when behind. It's just awful. So in that situation, it's much more likely that you want to limp behind, particularly if you've got multiple fish behind who are all going to come along for a nice friendly family limped pot, but they're also going to come along if you raise and you're just like burning extra money. You can still get a heap of money in there when you limp and flop a set in like a 4-way pot against Wales. You can just like check raise the flop big and go bet and get stacks in or whatever, or close to it. If you raise pre, sure, you build a bigger pot, but you miss the flop so often with the small pocket pair that you just don't compensate for that. And that's why we talk about frequent strength. That's why that's what we look for in the first point of the triangle. We look for frequent strength, being able to make good hands often, not being able to make monstrous hands rarely. So when we have a hand that's implied odds kind of in nature, like pocket 2s or 4-5 suited or jack 7 suited even, and there are a few limpers or one limper, and we think the table's loose and we don't have fold equity and we don't have enough frequent strength to ISO, as long as stacks are relatively like deep, they're not like stupidly small, we should definitely consider limping along and playing multi-way pots. It's like when you play live and you're just very often going to be coming along behind, flatting 8-6 suited when there've been even like one limper, because you just know the game is super passive. It's 1-2 no limit, and it's just going to go limp, and people are going to limp their ace queens and their king jacks and all that kind of stuff, and you're just going to see flops for cheap. And when you do connect hard, you're going to stack people because they can't fold post flop. So that's kind of the secret to 1-2 no limit. Limp a lot, don't ISO too much, because you just don't have the fold equity to go with hands that don't have frequent strength. But if you do have frequent strength in loose games, you might want to be making it even bigger to try and thin that field with your ace queen off or whatever the hand is. So that's a bit of an intro to what to do when someone's limped. The ISO triangle, just to recap, is the 3-point system of determining whether you've got enough good stuff to ISO. Those good things are position, frequent strength, and fold equity, either right now or more commonly on the flop. Then we have types of fish, and we can use them to assess how much fold equity we actually have. Against fit or fold fish, we isolate much wider ranges, particularly in position. Against more aggressive fish, we don't, and station fish, we favour hands with more frequent strength, and yeah, position again is always going to be a kind of constant. And then if we are not going to be isolating, then we can definitely consider limping behind, where we have good implied odds. It's not going to get raised often. We're looking at playing multi-way pots against bad players with hands that do flop really big, but rarely. Those are the hands that want to be limped. The hands that flop quite big, but often, these are the hands that want to be raised. Anyway, I hope that's useful. That's like an intro. That's chapter 2 of my book. Just the first part of that chapter, a very brief overview of it. I've missed out shitloads of examples, detail, extra kind of advice there that's in the book, obviously. Next time, I'm going to go over some examples for isolating and talk a little bit more about how to apply these factors and use this triangle in-game and how you can actually use that in your thought process. But for now, you know, you're playing poker in your next session. Try and think about these spots in terms of those 3 things: frequent strength, position, and fold equity. It's like the golden formula. It's the one I teach all my students for this kind of spot.